you also talk about how the you know when this segregation was implemented through public housing and other policies, it also further exacerbated the conditions in the pre-existing slums where many African Americans lived. Can you talk about the mechanism of that occurring?
Hey, this is Big Judah from out here in California, bringing another video to you guys. I've been doing some reading from some other books, and the book I've been reading lately is called The Color of Law. And it's a really interesting book that actually gives a lot of information as to how the Hebrews have gotten to the point that we've gotten to economically, and how the other nations have managed to keep themselves above us. Okay. I in my job, I work with a lot of proud Gentiles. The thing is, most of them don't know how they've accumulated their wealth. We always hear them say things like, "Well, I never had slaves," or the Irish were slaves, and look at how they are. But they don't really realize how, after the hundreds of years of slavery that we were put through, and after we were supposedly freed, how there's all these different laws that were put on the books to keep people of color down and keep white people and the other nations above us. Okay, which is of course is scriptural, because that's whole part of the curses. But they don't seem to think that. They just seem to think that they're on top just because they work hard, and that so-called African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans are just lazy, and that's why they don't have anything. Okay. So I was actually at a party yesterday, and there was a white guy, a spouse of one of the women I work with, and he was just talking about black people and how they move into these certain areas, and how they were clashing with the Mexicans and the Latinos and some of the people that were there. And I was explaining to him, I said, "Well, do you know why these people have to migrate to certain areas?" He's like, "Well, just because they want to." I'm like, "No," I says, "because of economic policies that this country has um, had and has put on the books for decades, that pretty much have hamstrung, their ability to rise in society." I said, just like, I said, your parents, I said, because I know about his family situation, they were able to buy nice houses in nice areas, but they were able to buy them when these houses were $20,000, $30,000. And now those houses are worth $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. I said, but did you know that they would not give blacks or so-called African Americans loans? The FHA programs would not give loans to our people, even though they qualified and everything else. They wouldn't give loans to them. And he just kind of gave me this dumb look, like, So when you actually hit them with facts, they're not even aware of a lot of the things that have happened, and why they've been able to ascend to such a higher status. Well, this quick video here is actually going to give you guys a lot of information. So a quick little 6-minute video, but there's a lot of information here. So let's take a look at this as we go.
Sure. I apologize. It's going to be a long answer. It's a bit complicated, but let me try and make it as brief as I can. I have to introduce it by telling you that another major federal program that the federal government implemented during World War II and afterwards, during the New Deal, was the Federal Housing Administration's program to create white subdivisions, white suburbs surrounding central cities across the country. And they built suburbs by guaranteeing loans to mass production builders of suburbs to on condition that those homes only be sold to white families, that no African Americans be permitted to buy homes. So, for example, the best known example perhaps.
Okay, so as you can see right there, they made laws that they would not give loans to so-called African Americans. And now this program was, they were building thousands of homes, and only white people could get loans for these homes. Now these homes were going. He's gonna go into more detail talking about how these homes were sold for $7,000 to $8,000. And then today they're worth between $400,000 to $600,000. And this goes into something I wanted to read from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 9. Let none of us go without his part of our voluptuousness. Let us leave tokens of our joyfulness in every place. For this is our portion, and our lot is this. Okay? They want to make sure that none of them go without their part. That's why they have laws that were pretty much only giving loans to white people, because this is their lot. This is part of their voluptuousness. And now it says, let us leave tokens of our joyfulness in every place. They were taking these homes and they were passing down from generation to generation. Okay, so they're just passing this down. They're tokens of their joyfulness in every place. This was a government program that was nationwide, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was going on. Let's go ahead and continue.
This is Levittown, east of New York City, where Levitt built 17,000 homes in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which he could never have assembled the capital to build on his own. Instead, the federal government guaranteed bank loans to Levitt to build that suburb on condition that he sell no homes to African Americans. And in addition, the federal government required that he put a clause in every deed in Levittown that prohibited resale to African. Well, this went on all.
So you see that even to get the loan, you couldn't sell to so-called African Americans, but in the deed, it made it so that you could not resell it or sell it to any African Americans as well. That was written into the deed. Okay. So that just shows you, the federal government only gave these loans to the whites, only allowed the resale of these loans to whites. But people are quick to talk about how today, well, you guys, you minorities are coming here and getting welfare. You're getting free food and free housing. They don't even realize that the people who have been benefiting from free housing or government subsidized housing has been white people the entire time. And they did it on a grand scale, nationwide, where they were giving these homes and this equity that these people were able to build up and pass on generation to generation, that our people were actually left out of the loop, and it was done on purpose. Okay, this was not on accident. This was done on purpose.
All across the country, and the mass suburbanization of the country. California, the biggest example of subdivisions built all over California on explicit condition set by the federal government that no homes be sold to African Americans. Once this was done, the civilian housing then became available again. There had been a big shortage before the 50s because no civilian housing was built during the war because building materials weren't permitted to be used for civilian construction. And there was a big housing backlog even before the war because of the Depression. So when civilian housing construction began again in the 1950s, and the Federal Housing Administration subsidized whites to move into these all-white suburbs, explicitly all-white by federal requirement, whites began to abandon the inner cities and abandon the public housing, which had been primarily designed for them before that time.
Okay, so here you go. Okay. Let me take a look here. Let's read Wisdom of Solomon chapter 2, verse 11. Let our strength be the law of justice, for that which is feeble is found to be nothing worth. So again, let our strength be the law of justice. They set up their laws for themselves, which therefore is their strength. Okay, their strength is in the laws that they set up, and then they, liberally implement these laws. If it is a Hebrew who breaks a law, well, we need to make sure we follow the letter of the law. If it's a Gentile, they're like, well, boys will be boys, and then they will not enforce the laws equally. Okay, that's how it's always been, and this is a prime example right here. With just even with housing, okay, and how the laws were only the only people that could get loans were whites nationwide. And people don't even know this information. I just barely learned about this information. Okay, it's pretty amazing. They talk about redlining and things like that, but once you really start to do some research, you start to see how widespread this was. Okay, and how it even affects our people all the way up till today. Let's continue.
There was public housing beginning in the mid-1950s, the white projects, and there were many, many more projects for whites at that time than there were for African Americans. White projects began to have large vacancies. Black projects had long waiting lists, and the reason was simply that the federal government was subsidizing whites to leave cities. Well, industry then began to leave cities as well. And so the African Americans who were living in public housing became poorer and poorer. Jobs disappeared. And
Okay, so that's a great point right there. So as the whites were leaving the inner cities and moving to the suburbs, so was the industry. They left the suburbs as well. They left to the suburbs also. Now, if the African Americans, so-called African Americans, could not buy homes out there, then they could not get jobs out there. Okay, so then they were stuck in the inner cities when the industry was leaving with lower paying jobs. Okay, and then they were stuck in a cycle of poverty from generation to generation. Okay, and then as the whites and the Gentiles were able to go out and buy properties in the suburbs, and then the good jobs moved out that way, they ended up having better jobs and more and better income, and they were being subsidized in their housing. And actually, there in some of the other readings I've been reading, it talked about how it's actually cheaper because of the subsidizing of the government to actually go out and buy a home in the suburbs, and it costs them more to rent an apartment actually in the city. So on top of it being cheaper, they were also building up equity in their homes at the same time. Okay, but this also goes with scripture. This is part of the curses. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 44, he shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. This is perfect right here because he shall lend to thee. He's lending to us, so therefore he's setting the parameters of how he's going to who he's going to lend to and the terms, okay, because he's the head and we're the tail. So if he wants to make up, if the Gentiles here want to make up laws, and then they're going to lend to their people and give them the best rates and everything else, that's scripture. I mean, that's part of the curses. Okay, I mean the curses are they're very very explicit, and you start getting into these other occurrences, you start to see how deep this goes. Okay, let's go ahead and continue.
African Americans were unable to gain the wealth that housing ownership created. So these policies resulted in greater poverty of the African American population.
And I wanted to ask you specifically about that because this really isn't only about residential segregation, as you just mentioned. It really is about the wealth that government policies created for white families that black families did not have access to. So when you look at the racial wealth disparities, the racial wealth gap today, you really trace it to these housing policies.
This is huge. Look at this. Okay, February 8th, 2017, this article came out. Black and Latino two-parent families have half the wealth of white single parents. Now, when you talk to other people, you talk to other nations, it's always, well, they just don't want to work hard. They just want to come up here and get free handouts and things like that. But that's not true. When you start to realize these government programs have subsidized white people this entire time, and the vast majority of white people, middle-class Americans' wealth comes from equity in your home, but then they did not allow us to even purchase these homes. Now you start to see why the wealth factor or the wealth gap is so big, and it's going to continue to talk about this. This is actually really good information right here, and it explains as to why the wealth of the other nations compared to ours is there's such a huge disparity, because they were getting subsidized loans and getting these homes pretty much just given to them for decades and decades and decades. Okay, so I used to think about that quite a bit. Okay, but I work with certain people, and I'm like, they don't make as much money as I do. How can they afford to have this house in this city, and I'm stuck living further away and having to commute to work? I said, how is that possible? I said, they can't be that much better with their money than I am. But now, I kind of find out that their parents were able to buy a house, right next door to each other, bought two houses, not just one, bought two houses right next to each other, and then, but when they were able to buy those properties, we were kept out. We weren't allowed to do that. So now a house maybe they bought for $20,000-$30,000 is now worth $700,000-$800,000. That's how they've done it. Let's continue.
Policies that started in the New Deal and
Take a look at this one. In DC, white families are on average 81 times richer than black ones. Let that sink in. In Washington, D.C., white families are on average 81 times richer than black ones. But if you talk to a white person, you bring this stuff up, oh, it's just because, well, I didn't have slaves. I just work hard. No, buddy. No, that's not why. Okay? That is not why at all. Let's continue.
continued in the decades after. Can you really give us a picture of that?
Sure. Well, let me go back to that example.
Before he gets in here again, like that's this one, the racial wealth gap. Why a typical white household has 16 times the wealth of a black one. That's what he's about to get into right now. So, once you get this information, you get armed with this information, you start hearing these people talking about, well, I didn't have slaves. They just need to work hard. They just need to pull themselves by their bootstraps. Yeah, well, if we all would have had the same opportunities like this country talks about, maybe we could have done that. But considering the fact now that you've done these kinds of things for decades and you're hiding this information, this is I didn't hear about this till recently, you know. But this is amazing information, and when you bring it up to these people, that say things like that, they just get dumbfounded because they have nothing to say because they don't even a lot of them don't even realize it.
Example I gave a minute ago of Levittown, in which is the most famous of these suburbs. These 17,000 homes east of New York City. Those homes sold in the late 1940s and early 1950s for about $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's dollars, that's about $75,000 to $100,000. And as I mentioned, only whites could buy it. There were many, many African Americans who could have afforded to buy homes in Levittown. $100,000 in today's dollars is about twice national median income. Working class families can afford to buy a home at twice national median income, African Americans as well as whites, but African Americans were prohibited. Instead, African Americans were living in cities and renting apartments. Whites were able to buy these homes. Well, today, homes in Levittown sell for $300,000, $400,000. That's 7, 8 times national median income. Unaffordable to working class families, to lower middle class families, whether they're white or black. So the white families who were able to buy into these suburbs that were created all over the country by the federal government, whites only, gained $200,000, $300,000 in equity appreciation over the next 2 generations. African Americans who were forced to only rent apartments because they were not permitted to live in the suburbs gained none of that equity appreciation. In the United States, most wealth of middle class families is attributable to the equity they have in their homes.
Most of the wealth comes from the equity in their homes for the middle class people that we were kept out of for decades. Let that sink in. That's where most of the wealth comes from white families, is the equity in their homes that we were kept out of by the federal government.
So today, nationwide, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity, the difference between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio, is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid 20th century.
So there you go. The vast majority of that discrepancy for the wealth comes from the federal program of the Federal Housing Authority, keeping people of color from allowing them to purchase houses in the suburbs. Okay. So I hope this video was edifying and gave you a little information. I hope you research this some more, because actually the color of law actually has a lot of different topics I'm probably going to be talking about. Some stuff talking about zoning, certain things talking about unions, because it's really good information. You can see how the Bible plays out in all different avenues of our existence, of our lives, and you can see how all these other nations have been conspiring against us. That's the Psalms 83 and the consulting together against us. I said, you see it. You can see it in all different avenues. That's why it's good to read other books as well. Other scriptures, of course, but also reading other books and relating it back to the scriptures, because everything comes back to the word of the Most High. All praise to Yahweh, B'Hashem Yahushai. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Shalom.